Hello, World History 2. The first thing you will need before we start our vodcast, which is like a podcast but with video, is your note sheet that you should have picked up today, titled Red China, Communism Begins to Spread, and we're starting on the second page. As I narrate through the notes, make sure you're filling in the blanks just like we do in class. However, there will be occasional questions punctuated throughout the video, so please write your answers on a separate sheet of paper so I can collect them tomorrow. The first thing we're going to talk about is what a proxy war is. A proxy is something that you can use remotely. So these proxy wars were wars fought between the United States and Soviet Union, but they weren't fought directly between them because remember, a Cold War doesn't have any of this direct conflict. So this was a way we could use our military to fight the Cold War without actually fighting the Russians. And the reason we needed to do that was because we needed to contain communism to places that had already taken hold, such as the USSR, Eastern Europe, and China. Now, we haven't talked about China yet, but that's what the rest of this lesson is going to be about. This is the foreign policy of containment. We want to contain communism. In other parts of the world, the U.S. needed to find ways to execute this policy without being directly aggressive to the USSR. My first question that I want you to write down on a separate sheet of paper is why didn't we want to be directly aggressive? Take a minute to record your answer and feel free to pause the video if you need more time. Okay, we're starting with the second world. Now you've probably heard about the first world and the third world countries, but we don't really talk that much about the second world. In the next few lessons we're going to talk about the third world and about the proxy wars, sorry. But what I want you to focus on today is the second world. This is a map of all the countries in the first world, second world, and third world. I have two questions for you, so this is questions 2 and 3. What countries are a part of each world? So you can list some of the main regions of the world for this one. Take a look at the areas of the map and what you notice about the colors. Now, the third question is, what do you think led to these classifications? What do these countries have in common? What do you think its people are like? What do you think its economy is like? Why are they classified into first, second, and third world? So these were terms coined by a French demographer, which means somebody who studies demography or populations, in 1952. The first world, he said, was the world where individual freedom, democratic elections, private property, capitalism, and Christianity prevailed. And this made this world, or regions, modern and prosperous. That's why the United States, Western Europe, and Australia are all a part of the first world. They were capitalists, they were very prosperous, and they really emphasized those individual freedoms and democracy. The second world is marked by the complete subjugation of the individual to the state. That means you give yourself over to the state and you are working for the good of the state. That's that collectivism ideology. They also had official atheism. Some of them had instances of genocide and enormous human suffering. So these are places like the USSR, Eastern Europe, and China. Then the third world is where the poorest of primitive peoples live. So these were people that were not progressive. They did not have the industry that we started the year off with. They had daily features of hunger, malnutrition, disease, filth, and misery. So these are places like Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia. Okay. Starting our talk about China, way back in the fall, we talked about China and the Qing dynasty and how imperialism caused the Qing dynasty to fall. So even before that, last year, remember that China was imperial and ruled by dynasties. In 1911, that Qing dynasty crumbled, just like the Jenga game that we played, and China became a republic. So this meant that a nationalist party came to power. The Nationalist Party didn't trust foreign powers based on our past actions. So we had a shaky friendship with the Soviet Union and they didn't trust us, the United States, fully because of that imperialism conflict. Remember all those opium wars and everything that had happened during that time period that we talked about back in the fall. So the Nationalist Party was kind of isolationist. However, in the 1920s and 30s, a civil war breaks out between the Nationalists and Communists. In 1925, a man named Chiang Kai-shek took over the Nationalist Party, so he was the leader of China from 1925. He did not like communists very much, and so many communists fled to the countryside of China to avoid being executed. So they kind of hid out in the underground for a while until it was safe to organize themselves as a party. And that time, throwing it back again to before World War II, 1931, you guys know this, Japan invades Manchuria. That is the location that is in darker pink on the map below. By 1937, Japan had launched an all-out invasion of China. So they had taken over the whole country. So that meant that the Civil War had to stop. So the communists and nationalists had to join forces against Japan. They had to gang up on Japan in order to remain one country. And so the nationalists and communists kind of forgot about their internal conflicts for a while to deal with this external conflict. So the leader, Chiang Kai-shek, who was a nationalist, focused on these international concerns. That allowed the Communist Party to regroup and become stronger as a party. So while the Japanese are in China, this allows communism, those seeds of communism, to start growing a little bit. And then, as you guys know, in 1939, World War II starts, and you know the rest of that story. Okay, checkpoint. Feel free to pause and take as much time as you need to answer these questions. What two groups fought for power in China in the 1920s and 30s? And how did Japan's invasion lead to the Communist Party becoming stronger? Okay. After Japan's invasion, and after World War II starts, Mao Zedong, or it's also said Zedong, depending on the translation, became the communist leader and organizer. He eventually becomes the leader of China from 1943 to 1976, and he's also known as Chairman Mao. He was the first chairman of Communist China, which is known even today as the People's Republic of China. They sometimes call it the PRC. You might see that some places. So Mao ended up mobilizing the communists and overthrowing Chiang Kai-shek through this communist revolution. After he becomes leader of China and after World War II finally ends, he starts to instate some of these reforms. And as you can see, there are three main areas that he wanted to reform: agriculture, industry, and the family. So he wanted to divide land among the peasants and form communes and collective farms. He also wanted to nationalize private companies, and he had these very high production goals, which are featured in his 5-year plans, which we're going to talk about next. And then he also had some interesting things for the family, which we'll talk about more when we get to the history of China in the 4th advisory. So the first reform is the 5-year plans. These are his initiatives for Soviet-style reforms accomplished in 5-year intervals. So they focused on industry and the economy. He hoped to really jumpstart this industry by turning over all the factories so that they belong to the state, while also putting in place socialist social reforms among society. The first one of these was between 1953 and 1957, and it was very successful. Then he hoped to expand this success with the Great Leap Forward, and it was a very ambitious program to collectivize agriculture and form communes. So that is that collective farm where he takes all the farmland, turns it over to the state, and then breaks it up into large chunks that people were paid to work. However, he didn't really plan this that well, and the industries were still kind of inefficient. 5-year plans kind of fell by the wayside, and then there was some natural disasters and some crop failures. So the Great Leap Forward was discontinued in 1961. Checkpoint number 2. How did Chairman Mao hope to reform China? You can list just the 3 areas here. Number 7, what were 2 reform movements he attempted? And number 8, what model was Chairman Mao attempting to replicate? The next phase of Mao's leadership is called the Cultural Revolution of China. This had the goal to enforce communism in the countryside by removing capitalist, traditional, and cultural elements from Chinese society and to impose Maoist orthodoxy within the party. So this was kind of Chairman Mao's interpretation of the Soviet orthodoxy, which is their ideology or their list of things that they want to accomplish in their philosophy. This cultural revolution marked the return of Mao Zedong to a position of power after he botched the Great Leap Forward. So one of the first things he does is he endorses this group known as the Red Guards. The Red Guards were student-formed militia units, and they had the goal of establishing a society of peasants and workers, so taking both the agriculture and the industrial piece in which all were equal. Remember, communism is equality. This quote in red is one of the quotes from one of his Red Guard soldiers. And he says, Chairman Mao has defined our future as an armed revolutionary youth organization. So, if Chairman Mao is our Red Commander-in-Chief, and if we are his Red soldiers, who can stop us? First, we will make China red from inside out, and then we will help the working people of other countries make the world red, and then the whole universe. So, one thing that is not written down on this slide, and I apologize, but you may rewind and pause as much as you like. I would like you to write down for question number 8 is how this Red Guard soldier contradicts the U.S. foreign policy of containment. How does this relate to that? So the Red Guard, one thing that it did was shut down colleges and schools. And it also targeted anyone with privileges or resisted regime. It wanted everyone to be absolutely equal. And they were really the drivers of change during the Cultural Revolution. However, there was chaos that ensued, and factories and farm production were threatened by this Cultural Revolution. About 1.5 million people were killed, and millions of others suffered imprisonment, seizure of property, torture, or just general humiliation. This radical movement was so drastic that it led to calls for modernization in China and a more moderate approach. The people in China were like, hold up, Chairman Mao, we need to cool our jets on this communism thing because this is very, very bad. People are dying, they're being tortured, it's not good for the country. So eventually the Red Guard is dissolved. The final thing I want you to do before our learning reflection is to complete the Venn diagram on your note sheet, so this is right under that section of notes, between the USSR and Stalin's reforms and Mao's reforms in China. And finally, our learning reflection. What effect do you think China's joining the Second World of Socialist States had on the relationship between the US and USSR? What possible consequences can you foresee? So this is a prediction. Also, I want to mention before the podcast or the screencast ends, if you have any questions about the lecture, make sure you write them down on your sheet of paper and I will try my best to answer them for you. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you tomorrow.